Project Lawful aka Planecrash by Arwayne aka Eliezer Yudkowsky and Lintamande.
The only thing necessary is for good men to do nothing. Edmund Burke abridged. Time, about a week later. Place the imperial palace in Igorian, capital of Cheliax. This aerial view shows the side of the palace that contains the Magistrix's quarters, including some rooms with windows and even the occasional exposed balcony. All such are guarded by a permanent wall of force. The surrounding aerial volume is patrolled by a species of keen-eyed flying devil with natural arcane sight and invisibility detection, lest anyone be so daring as to seek a glimpse of Abigail Thrune in her nightgown, or maybe observe her in meeting and read her lips. Forbiddance, wall of force, patrolling devils. These are the standard precautions taken in accordance with such security mindset as Cheliax has developed, pertaining to known and customary threats at their technology level, magical level, and accustomed levels of opposed intelligence. Also in the air above Igorian is a tiny translucent sphere. Even a keen-eyed and arcane-sightful devil has negligible probability of spotting it. The floating glass bead is small, clear, weakly magical, and not that close to the imperial palace. Tiny translucent sphere, Arwayne. Let's take this moment in time to talk, as one often does, about IOUN stones. IOUN stones look like simple floating colored shapes unless you use detect magic on them, in which case they look insanely complex and maybe even paradoxical. The spell forms they maintain behave like continuous spell-like abilities of living magical creatures, like something alive is maintaining a spell form that couldn't be held together by any static shape or cycle of magical forces, only by an organism that perceives and reacts. IOUN stones circle above their wielder's head through any amount of gymnastics and dodge blows as if they were alive. If you own more than one, they'll form themselves into pretty aerial patterns. Outwardly, they look like simple gems. Inwardly, they're filled with tiny three-dimensional magic channels of surpassing complexity. It's an obvious to Golarian artificers hypothesis that IOUN stones are alive, and were, given known Aslanti habits, created by some horrifying sacrifice of intelligent lives, and maybe even souls. That the tiny intricate channels are there, not to maintain the outer spell form, but to imprison the essence of some living thing that does maintain it. And yet no known divination shows any hint of necromancy about IOUN stones, no life, no soul. It's a slightly less obvious hypothesis that some mysterious quality of animation or sapience was transferred into IOUN stones, extracted from an animal or a soul, the way that the potency of spell silver can be burned into things that are not spell silver. An awful number of awful experiments have failed to make any progress on this hypothesis either. Not being stupid, plenty of wizards have thought of the possibility that both obvious hypotheses are just plain wrong, and maybe there's some kind of living magic effect that you could create with those intricate magical channels, and that is what navigates the IOUN stone's flight and maintains its spell form, and nobody's ever made progress on figuring out this hypothesized living magic either, as might be the key to many different rumored aspects of Aslanti artifice. Given the vast intricacy of IOUN stones, it doesn't look like an overwhelmingly promising thing to figure out by poking around. Every artificer whose thinking gets that far dreams of finding the earlier prototype of an IOUN stone, something which, on this general class of hypothesis, maintains some much simpler form of living magic that you actually could understand, and maybe then you could decode the more complicated spell forms. Carissa and her ex are not the only beings with INT-29 ever to examine ancient Aslanti IOUN stones. They are, however, the first ones to do so, already having some idea of what a low-tech computer might look like, and the first ones to do so having built their own magical simulator of magical physics, which gives them A, actual experience in magical analog signal processing, and B, the ability to simulate unseen magical interactions in some detail. To be clear, the tiny translucent sphere is very barely an IOUN stone. It does not fly around its wielder through all combat circumstances, but only floats in a single place relative to the rotating planet. The only spell effect it maintains is a special weaker case of prestidigitation. It could not restore itself after a dispel. You couldn't say it was reverse-engineered from an Aslanti IOUN stone, so much as re-engineered from scratch after looking at the partially decodable surface features of an IOUN stone for very loose inspiration. Maybe the best metaphor would be somebody designing an analytical engine from scratch after staring at a computer built from vacuum tubes and managing to decode key abstract concepts but not the actual software. And yet, in the final analysis, it's fair to say that Carissa Seaver went and made a literal fucking IOUN stone, the first one to be made since Aslant fell. Many artificers over many centuries have regarded this as the dangling ultimate capstone achievement of mortal magecraft, short of the differently unreachable realms of artifacts. But once you've actually built your first IOUN stone, you can see that it's really just a baby's first step into an unimaginably vaster realm. The space of Aslanti artifice is just the space of all other magic items, once you move past the realm of statically constructed magic items and into those that cast a sense-compute motor loop to model and maintain a dynamic spell form. Literal fucking ION stone Irwane. The spell form of the tiny translucent sphere could be analogized to a stripped-down prestidigitation, receiving small-dimensional input commands from a simulated wizard. First, the tiny translucent sphere maintains approximately the same station, relative to the palace in Igorian, or rather the rotating form of Golarion. It resists lesser wind currents over its quite small surface area, maintained by prestidigitation's pound of force. Second, when activated by a light pressure of magic cast through a scry, the tiny translucent sphere changes the refractive index of light in a lens-shaped volume nearby. Further light pressures of magic through the scry will rotate and shift that refractive lens. Finally, the tiny translucent sphere, this part took no additional effort at all, has a magical signature that is unique across Golarion and a number of neighboring planes, which is to say, the tiny translucent sphere acts as a combination scry anchor and telescope for purposes of scanning across the side of the Imperial Palace, containing Abigail Thrune's quarters, with windows and balconies shielded by a permanent wall of force. You could use the IOUN Stone of Peeping to verify her presence, read lips if you focused closely enough, and were sufficiently good at reading lips, maybe even get a glimpse of her walking around in a nightgown. Whether you wanted to do that, of course, would depend on your utility function and your purposes and your plans.
Aspexia Rugaton now walks those same halls, decorated in what another place would call doompunk, appointed in gold and crimson more than red and black, with traces of imperial purple never permitted to overshadow hell's colors. The ignorant commoners of Cheliax are sometimes reassured it's not that Cheliax serves hell, rather it's hell that serves Cheliax. But this is a lie, and everyone of sense knows better. Hell is far greater than Cheliax, and for a great power to serve a lesser one is contrary to the Chelish state religion. Aspexia Rugaton is heading for a meeting with Abigail Thrune, pondering, as she walks, the best way to share certain major recent news, a surprise from the distant chaotic evil land of Wanshou. It could be seen as hopeful news, is the problem. One of the few aspects of trope reasoning that Aspexia is confident she's understood is the notion that a hope once spoken aloud in front of a viewpoint character cannot come to pass, or at least not come to pass exactly as it's spoken. Some of Keltham's spell silver plans worked as he intended, but that was only possible because of the conspiracy. Things were not really going well for him by his current lights. Aspexia Rugaton has, of course, considered the possibility that she herself is a viewpoint character, considered it, and discarded it. Her thoughts simply are not as dramatic as the thoughts of the trope girls like Abigail, and the story has not so far seemed interested in tormenting her the way it torments Abigail.
In a chamber on that side of the palace sits Queen Abigail II, contemplating a recent report of her own, though at present she is just looking up from that report to gaze upon the grand high priestess of Asmodeus, whose attendance upon herself Abigail has demanded. Abigail is not even striking a pose here, this is just her resting queen face.
You said you had news of Keltham?
So I infer.
I continue to imagine that such news was supposed to come to me before you, not the other way around.
That would require you to understand what you're seeing. You have not the cunning to understand or even notice Keltham's handiwork, or Sivar's for that matter. Your underlings even less.
The quality of their interactions has been strained of late, but if you don't know how to take that in stride, in Cheliax, you are not long for politics in the country. Tell me of it, then.
That discussion may consume some time. We should dispense with shorter matters before then, if you've any small reports to make or little questions to ask of me.
As you will, then. I'm concerned with how you remain unassassinated.
People have been saying that about me for a while.
Be serious. I'm worried that Keltham hasn't killed you yet. He has not much time left to do that before your child quickens with soul. It's possible Keltham hasn't figured things out at all, but with you staying so much in the palace, he may not have had an easy chance to.
If I leave the palace under unusual conditions, if I make myself an easy and predictable target for temporary assassination, Keltham may deduce exactly what I'm doing and why. Asmodia was your own pet. Did you learn nothing from her?
Her voice is a bit dry. I am not sure I so trust all this complicated reasoning that I wouldn't give Keltham a shot at killing you some easy way, instead of prompting him to, perhaps, crater all Igorian for it. We should not neglect the ordinary form of the game while we chase this absurdly elaborated one.
I suppose I could stage some affair that leaves me exposed at a predictable place and time. Whereupon Keltham, if he is truly wished and headbanded up to INT-29, will deduce exactly what I'm doing and why. And maybe even that you were the one stupid enough to order me to do it? Would that make you happy?
Perhaps I will think on it.
How goes your training of the would-be keepers of Asmodeus, as holds you back from so much other valuable work in time of approaching war, on only the word of a chaotic god? Are there any hopes vague enough to be told me?
She frowns. Vague enough?
If it's mysterious to me and not too hopeful, if the audience wouldn't know what you're talking about, that shouldn't prevent things from going mostly as you plan. Abigail Thrune is not aware of how her own desperation to know, to be back in the loop on things, to be told anything, or for that matter given some hope of regaining her story relevance and pride, is skewing this judgment.
Matters with the keepers of Asmodeus go about as well as could be expected. It would lack dignity if Aspexia Rugaton cackled evilly. She hasn't done that since she stopped adventuring and went into administration. Also, of course, she'd never show that much emotion in front of Abigail, and also it'd probably be too much hope to give her. Matters with the keepers of Asmodeus are going at least as well as could possibly have been expected. Only the shadow of Caden Kylian's involvement, that he somehow expects to benefit from this alongside Asmodeus, would hold Aspexia back from breaking into full-scale maniacal laughter if she were in private.
You can probably go slightly less vague than that. Are Asmodeus's keepers all 6 circles? Has one reached 8th circle? Are they a significant enough military force to matter?
Asmodeus has granted all of them his 2nd circle, which is as much and more than any sane person would have hoped for. All who've reached the 2nd circle of wizardry are now training in mystic theurgy beside. Which is another thing that Aspexia would laugh about maniacally under better circumstances. Who would have thought that intelligence properly trained could become a wisdom bonus to make for Asmodeus a cadre of wizard priests? Her eventual successor may have power enough to go toe-to-toe with Nefredi Klepati without 2 8th circles backing her up about it. But, Aspexia continues, if 22nd circles, of whom 14 are training as bare apprentice mystic thurges, are a military key to victory, the path is hidden from my sight. Even if all 20 of them would choose hell over Elysium.
You're almost smiling.
You would almost smile too in my position. I've gotten them started on intrigues and backstabbing each other for pride of position, the stronger bending the weaker to their uses, and they are scrupulous about never doing so in a way that inhibits their group productivity. Aspexia Rugaton doesn't know why all this teaching matters, but it's so satisfying that she's not doing much questioning of Snack Service's claim that it does. Any good news from Corva Talandria that wasn't so good it had to be kept from you?
Abigail now deeply regrets having ever entangled herself with that woman, as now chains Abigail to her management. Abigail had meant Corva to run the program for injuring Keltham with his asked but unwanted 144 children. But Corva's desperately concealed revulsion at the thought was such that Abigail doubted the tropes of forcing Corva to do what had been meant as a gift to her of satisfying revenge. And as later attempts soon proved, Corva Talandria seemed to be made desperately unhappy. Corva didn't voice it, of course, but it was unconcealable in her thoughts, by almost any possible task that Abigail presented for her consideration. Abigail's actual conclusion is that Corva is the walking emotional disaster that Keltham thought she was, that he in fact correctly identified her trope, and that Corva will remain an emotional disaster until Keltham somehow wins her back over, and fucks it out of her or beats it out of her or whatever he is supposed to do. Talandria guesses that at her present rate of progress on diamond chemistry, she might in the best case be able to produce her first specks of diamond dust in another month or two, and greatly scale the process around a month after. Abigail answers. Every task Abigail suggested had just made the jilted trope girl tie herself into a tighter knot of unhappiness and self-hate, until finally, Abigail had left Corva to her own choice of tasks, and that had been what she'd picked, even before the news out of the city of Brass. Talandria's alchemical investigation says that diamond is primarily a crystal of element 6, the key ingredient of coal, possibly adulterated with some further element or quality that her spectroscopes can't detect yet. If there is no hidden ingredient to it, she expects that the right use of heat and pressure should be able to form purified element 6 into diamond, given that it seems to form naturally in the ground to be mined, and what Keltham said of such geological processes. But she guesses the synthesis results will come out as diamond dust, and forming large pure crystals will prove much harder. Talandria is skeptical of Keltham's maybe capability to make smaller diamonds into large ones. She guesses that without knowing the exact crystal structure, Keltham shouldn't be able to prestidigitation alchemize 2 diamonds into one larger diamond, no matter how cleanly cut their matched surfaces, or if he's able to work within a vacuum. It didn't happen naturally when Talandria tried it, nor when she attempted obvious blind manipulations of potential energy surfaces. Talandria remembers, and transcripts agree, that Keltham at INT 18 said he couldn't think of any simple way to find crystal structures without advanced technology out of civilization, specifically generators for ultra-tiny light particles and very fine detectors for those.
Aspexia doesn't bother to comment anything along the lines of unlimited diamond dust for permanencies seems enough to win this whole war, whether Cheliax obtained it first or Osirion did. This is obvious to both of them, along with the fact that they shouldn't take a few extra months to wait. It seems some evidence against the image of Keltham's apparent doings reported by Hell out of the city of Brass, I suppose, and the image of his purchase orders for smaller diamonds in Golarion. I'm not Asmodia to say how much evidence in numbers.
It's the sort of thing that a smarter Keltham would enjoy bluffing us about. That seems more than probable. The probability that he could actually do it. Talandria thought she'd have put 5% on it, if the question hadn't immediately made her think it more probable.
I do presume you've instructed Talandria that if she does have some unexpected breakthrough, she is to conceal it from you and report it first through church channels?
Naturally, Abigail says with considerable bitterness, all carried by the word itself rather than any slippage of tone.
And the status of the rest of Project Lawful?
Doing no better or worse than I expected. No great breakthroughs in chemistry since last you asked. No new information of Keltham's stolen from the scientific revolution beyond what we've spied already. Maritzel, Yaisa, and Gregoria are all being maintained in a state that should fall well short of Keltham needing to rescue them. Talandria seems unalterably miserable. I've had her research section moved somewhere that Keltham seizing her wouldn't do as much damage. Mayal is not recovered, and will probably not recover fully, but I'm keeping him in best condition to be held as negotiating material against Sevar, whom I read as possibly caring about him. Likewise, those security besides Olegario who were most loyal to her. And that useless fool whom Sevar rescued from my dungeons. We are not instructed by our Lord to hold no hostages against Sevar, and she earlier stated that the lawful evil form of decision theory should concede it no threat if you're the sort of person who'd enjoy wrecking somebody that Sevar cared about, but might refrain from doing so if paid.
Careful. That seems perilously close to stating a hopeful plan aloud. In fact, I would say that you've gone and said it.
Abigail's lips press together thinly, but she makes no reply to this. Any news of Pilar Pineda that I'm permitted to know about, since that too is now apparently being routed through your offices? It can be good news so long as it's sufficiently enigmatic and confusing, remember?
I expect many of the reports I'm receiving are false. Either that, or Pineda has gotten herself into an amount of salacious trouble that I would have sincerely thought required time dilation.
It's probably that second one.
If they're all true, Pineda has gotten herself into way more salacious trouble than I expected, even taking into account that she's a trope girl.
I'm sure people end up saying that in Aerolarps all the time. Are there any new major political implications of Pineda's deeds that I should know in order to do my job as queen?
Pineda was spotted in one show. In other news, the elder kraken who ruled that land has perished, and one show's new government has declared themselves lawful evil now, with a state flag depicting a great city amid flames. Quite the remarkable decision for a land claimed for the last century by chaotic evil, though they declare themselves strictly independent of Cheliax if not hell. The words are no lie, but they are very finely sliced. It's the sort of thing that the queen genuinely needs to know about, that one show has been claimed in the name of hell. That's going to affect her affairs of state. Aspexia wants to try and see if it's possible to keep from Abigail the news that Pilar's involvement was merely her self-prophesied kidnapping in a scandal leading to the downfall of half of the one show government's ministers. Almost immediately after those ministers had been appointed by Carissa Sevar, who had come to Wanshou's small mortal government amid their ruined capital Numijan, presenting herself in Arkmaji's robes with Eowyn stones orbiting her head, claiming that she in single combat slew their former ruler Janagor, whose vast eyeball, scorched and ruined, she cast down before them as a proof, and proclaiming that she now claimed their country in the name of hell to be ruled by and for her cult, and that any within Wansho who reached at least neutral evil from chaotic evil and did her service in life and called her name in death would have their souls claimed by her. Exactly one former governing slave of Janagor did challenge Sevar, but he died upon the spot, and without Sevar having turned her head in his direction. Sever worked upon a gate of ruined Numijan that had faced Janagor's waters, setting in place prepared ornaments but enchanting the whole. A gate, she said, to sear the exact words of her compact with Asmodeus onto the skin of any who walked through, and none could join her government or lead in her cult who had not walked through. Sevar then departed without fanfare, her appearance having lasted less than an hour. If teleports were free, as the saying goes, quite a lot of lawful evil people would already be in Wanshou, Rugatan doesn't doubt. As it stands, an impressive number of lawful evil individuals who can afford teleports have appeared in Wanshou, and some of those were appointed by Sevar to be its new government, answerable to herself as sovereign in the name of hell. Only half of those ministers, however, had political careers that survived Pilar Pineda's advent shortly after. Posing as a Severist, young, beautiful, seemingly innocent, exuding timid submissiveness and frightened sexuality. Witnesses interviewed by a church agent afterward reported a level of seductive appeal more often associated with literal succubi than with Splendor 21. That Pilar was promptly kidnapped and abused by some of the new government leaders is not what caused the downfall of the ministers responsible. Wanshou's new government is evil. Rather, apparently, those ministers were inept kidnappers and got in each other's way rather than sharing, which proved them to be bad at coordination and operations work. Pilar, it is said, revealed her true identity as she who bears cake and told all her kidnappers to resign, and threatened the remaining ministers that if they didn't do better at lawful evil, she'd come back and get kidnapped again. Some of the disgraced ministers hesitated to obey, the story continued, but in that very moment a roar had resounded as the capital was attacked by one of Janagor's spawn, whom Pilar slew, and then provided condiments for its roasting and distribution to the citizenry. The disgraced ministers had obediently resigned. Then, after Pilar returned and eyed them meaningfully while hefting a bag of salt. All this news should basically not be possible to keep from Abigail, unless the tropes can prevent Abigail from hearing somehow. Aspexia is curious to see if they do.
How nice of you to fucking tell me, Rugaton. That's going to be so much fun to navigate in international relations, especially on the swift heels of Pineda's doings in Corvosa. I suppose we're invading Osirion anyways, and that takes us past the point where Cheliax can present itself to even the most gullible countries as not being an expansionist threat. but it would have been nice if the more distant lands had deluded themselves for longer into thinking that only our immediate neighbors stood in danger.
I told you not that long after I heard.
Abigail's lips pressed together bitterly. That it's deliberate doesn't make it any less her true emotion. I cannot rule like this, Rugaton. I can hardly think like it. It is stifling to the point that I might as well be a statue myself for all the good I can do.
You know, Aspexia remarks conversationally, I have never been able to understand, on some deep level, why it is that mortals, other than myself, of course, find themselves compelled to think so many harmful thoughts as will bring them injury or discontent. I just don't think thoughts like that, haven't my whole life. I've never truly understood why others don't do the same. You are not wiser than me, but you are wiser than I was when I was 12 years old and doing better than this. Have you tried to just not think those thoughts and also not feel stifled about not thinking them?
The Queen does not dignify this with a response. Those were all the lesser questions I had of you.
And I of you. Now what's this news you said you had of Keltham that should have proceeded through the church before it came to the Queen?
The Queen lifts the sheaf of papers in her hand. I pray this report about the recent Whisperwood incident was routed to you literally at all?
Matters of the Dark Tapestry are reported to my office immediately, yes. You believe Keltham was involved in that? To what end? Stranger things happen daily in Golarion, and we can hardly attribute them all to Keltham's hand.
Her voice is a pleasant one now, and in truth a little of Abigail's injured pride has been restored. You and your underlings are all idiots. I will summarize this report, in case the general trend has been lost within the details. 1. A mad cleric, posthumously identified as Vedis Halurexis, kidnapped a Chelish farming village and brought them to the Pillar of Palamia in our northwestern Whisperwood. The sacrifices were bound and enshrouded in darkness and silence, but one among their number was a tiefling of Devil's Line who could see through deeper darkness. Hence, supposedly, our apparently accidental reception of this report. 2. Vedis Halurexis shattered the Pillar of Palamia, previously thought to be a monument to some unknown god, with a great explosion of flames whose description does not particularly match any known spell signature. The idiots who produced this report failed to consider that chemistry might be a means of producing this explosion. I have commanded Project Lawful to examine the Whisperwood site to see if they can detect any useful residues that can hint to us about how we could make our own great explosions. 3. A huge horror from the Dark Tapestry bubbles up from the ground. A great ooze, forming and reforming hands and teeth and faces, and mouths presumably gibbering blasphemies that were silenced. 4. Before the gathered villagers can be sacrificed, an as-yet unidentified person in the uniform of Chelish security appears. The apparent security approaches Vedis Halurexis without attacking. Halurexis attacks with a quickened spell once the mage is near. Halurexis's head explodes. 5. The gathered sacrificial villagers hear a male voice informing them that rescue has arrived, but they will wait in protective darkness and silence for a time, as there are heretical affairs going on outside. 6. The strange mage flies above the horror from the Dark Tapestry and engages in several inscrutable activities. They included casting flashes of light and trying to drop animal sacrifices onto the horror in different numbers and groups. Our apparent witness thinks he remembers seeing early on 1 flash, 2 flashes, 3 flashes, 5 flashes, and a similar pattern appearing among the animal sacrifices dropped down. Does that pattern signify any particular Dark Tapestry eldritchness to you?
Not that I've been told of. I'll inquire of Gorthoclek.
I suppose it's possible you might be telling the truth about that, in any case. 7. The mage eventually gives up on whatever ritual or bargaining he was trying to perform, if that's even what was happening, and spends nearly an hour casting an incredible variety of different attack magics on our Dark Tapestry horror, using items and scrolls for it, increasing in their magnitude and spell circle over time. The Dark Tapestry horror writhes and throws its bubbling self about, probably screams unheard in voices that would drive mortals mad, is little damaged by the spells and regenerates the damage swiftly. 8. The mage finally destroys the Dark Tapestry horror with another vast explosion. Still guised as a Chelish security, he unblinds and frees the gathered sacrifices, informs them that the day's events will no doubt be classified a secret of Cheliax, and commands them to go home and say nothing of this. He throws down some silver and a few gold coins, saying that he's not troubling himself to distribute it, but he does expect all there will receive, and keep a payment for silence, and states that the consequences of running their mouths will be left to their imagination. 9. The next day, our single witness tiefling heads into the nearest town and reports,
I suppose I see the connection to Keltham's chemical secrets, now that you've pointed it out, in the form of great explosions that a tiefling villager's description couldn't identify as spell work. I still don't see what purpose Keltham would have in...
If we believe our tiefling subjects' eyes, then who the fuck else would have access to that quantity of scrolls and magic items and would use them to run inscrutable experiments on a horror out of the dark tapestry? And if we don't believe his eyes, only Keltham would think of casting that illusion or falsifying that memory.
Aspexia doesn't quite think in that way herself. It isn't really a compliment to notice that Abigail Thrune seems able to put herself in those shoes. I see. And do you know the purpose of all that?
Abigail Thrune laughs. It's high and bitter. It might perhaps be tinged with a touch of madness, if her splendor permitted any such thing to enter her voice, which it doesn't. Oh, I know what we're meant to think. The same way we were meant to think that Keltham has a means for aggregating lesser diamonds into greater ones. Unless, of course, that simply is what Keltham was about, in the City of Brass. And he didn't bother to conceal it from us because he thinks there's nothing we can do. Things out of the dark tapestry cause fear. They cause horror. Even a very prepared mind will still feel that fear, it is said. You must find fighters and wizards with high wisdom to gather about you and conclude the fight quickly lest they all go mad. Who fights a horror like that for an hour, casting spells of increasing power, when they evidently have the means about themselves to kill it more quickly? Why?
It takes Aspexia a moment to get that, and then her eyes widen very slightly yet visibly, so vast is her dismay. For wizards and sorcerers to deliberately put themselves in a situation that outwardly seems painful and scary, but is ultimately safe, in order to increase their power, does not in fact work. Otherwise, everyone would do it. Abigail Thrune staked her life when she went to hell, forfeit if she could not reach at least the 5th circle of sorcery, so that she would be frightened enough despite having deliberately put herself into that situation. As for putting yourself under sufficient stress via exposing yourself to a powerful horror from the dark tapestry, well, the obvious reason why not everyone does that is that you would go insane.
I quote from the Project Lawful transcripts. Civilization would cheat. They'd figure out exactly what mental state somebody had to be in to absorb extra magic like Carissa did during her date with Abigail, and then some 6th-rank keepers would go into that exact mental state on purpose because they could just do that, and very, very quickly civilization would have its own powerful wizards. End quote. He told us, back when he was more naive, exactly how a person like him thinks about the problem of only being a 1st circle wizard, showed how much disdain he had for the thought of his civilization needing to earn power the hard way. Put yourself under the right kind of stress, into the right mental state, and channel sufficient magic from enough items and scrolls. That's how he thinks of it, and all our lifelong struggles a meaningless ritual we go through because we're dumber than he is. Is he now 5th circle, to match his rival and lover Carissa? 9th circle with Savar finding her own way of it? Who the fuck knows? Or, of course, that's all just what he wants us to think.
The thought occurs to Aspexia that perhaps Keltham tried his clever idea, spending increasing amounts of money on casting from more powerful scrolls. But by the time he was done, he was, say, only 2nd circle and starting to go permanently insane despite his alien disciplines. So he slaughtered the horror and went on his way. It even matches Aspexia's understanding of tropes. It would be humorous, she does understand humor, especially cruel humor, if Keltham went to all that work, maybe did himself some permanent damage, in order to gain one caster circle he could as well have gained from harder, longer study. And a fine joke if Abigail then became unduly terrified of him, too. Aspexia doesn't say it out loud, It's a hopeful thought, so it must be kept from anyone who might be a viewpoint character. Or on the other side of things, also an overly hopeful thought, maybe Abigail remains unassassinated because Keltham has already gained greater interests than Cheliax, maybe greater than all creation, if the tropes operate on scales larger than that. Maybe the story's ending, from Golarian's perspective, is that Keltham simply pursues his own inscrutable purposes from now on, in a way that leaves world politics untouched. It would be a beautiful blow to Abigail's mighty pride if Keltham's pride deemed her beneath its own notice. Maybe he has reached the ninth circle indeed now, and the report was accidental from his perspective, and none of it is about Abigail in the slightest because she isn't that important. To Aspexia, at least, it seems like this would be a nicely dramatically resonant ending to the story, which really does give her some substantial hope for it being true. If Keltham is in some sense smarter than just INT-29 implies, he may be so intelligent as to be, in an odd way, harmless to Asmodeus's plans for Golarion, having outgrown the mortal concerns that once led him to meddle. "Is there anything you believe we ought to be doing about it, if you're right?" Aspexia says aloud.
If he's now fifth circle? It makes no difference, I can understand. I can't see the plot which depends on Keltham being fifth circle in his own right, rather than using scrolls or hirelings. If he's gone over to the upper end of ninth circle magic and can cast wishes in his own right from an unlimited supply of diamonds, then our planned assault on Osirion, which approaches by the day, is doomed even if Keltham would not destroy all Cheliax to halt it.
It's a hopeful thought, and so I wouldn't usually speak it to you, but you can't have missed that Keltham might have arranged that play intending you would conclude that—
Fool. Keltham would know that, did I find myself deciding to stay my invasion for reasons traceable to information Keltham might have chosen to give me. I'd question if that decision might have been intended, and not actually stay my hand from Osirion, without first, for example, asking Keltham to demonstrate his ninth circle power. If he was actually ninth circle and wanted me to not invade, he could do it that way directly. Only hinting at it implies his actual weakness. Therefore, he is not doing it for hopes that I'll refrain from invasion, for if I found myself refraining from invasion on that account, I'd thereby know he'd planted the information to that end. And so, since I will not refrain from invasion, I go back to wondering if he is in fact ninth circle, or if he planned my receipt of the information, and it is meant to accomplish something else. You lack talent at using cunning, Rugaton, for all that your headgear grants you a little more than you were born with.
My wisdom whispers to me that such intricate reasoning seems risky. I sometimes reason as if gods can predict our choices, since often they can, but when I reason so, I reason in fewer steps.
It would not be reliable thinking if we were trying to ravel anyone else but Keltham, or perhaps now also Sivar. They might miss some step of that reasoning that I have reasoned they would use. But Keltham has grown up in an entire society that makes legend and custom of games like these. He will not miss any step of the reasoning, and therefore my reasoning over his reasoning is reliable. And he knows that I will not miss it, for he taught that subject explicitly, and he knows I have read his transcripts. There is no consistent story where Keltham tries to scare me off from invasion, for he knows that, in the moment of my deciding not to invade, I would thereby know that had been the purpose of his bluff. So whatever is going on, it is not that.
Perhaps he's doing it to drive you mad with worry and make you less useful to Cheliax, since that seems to be the result being achieved. Or maybe Keltham is tormenting Abigail for his own sadistic amusement, in preparation for returning to claim her as vengeance bride and torture doll. He's intelligent enough by now to have thrown off the chains that Dath Ilan lays upon its peasantry. But this, yet again, is a hopeful thought and should not be spoken aloud before Abigail.
That presumes there's something I would figure out, of danger to him, if I'm not given other things to worry about.
Isn't that a hopeful thought?
Not for these purposes, no. It sets up a mystery whose answer the audience hasn't heard yet. This situation is not tenable, Rugaton. You may be wise, but you are not smart enough to ravel these puzzles in my place.
And you're not smart enough either, and less wise than I. We will keep the command structure as it is.
It is ultimately my decision.
So it is, and I've just informed you of which decision is the correct one.
Abigail doesn't give her the satisfaction of snarling. This is madness. Cheliax cannot possibly win like this, with its greatest mind cowering inside a prison cell with imaginary bars. Better that I should take all the knowledge and decisions back into my own hands, and trust that the tropes will reward a real fight more than these pathetic attempts to manipulate them.
You tried your hand at tropery, calling on them to witness your tryst with Sever, and that went miserably to all our costs. You were given your one chance at this way of thinking, and you failed it.
And you are succeeding?
So far as Aspexia knows, Cheliax has had no further disasters brought on by hubris, which is really a lot of what wisdom buys you in life, she feels. That's a foolish question to ask out loud. What do you expect the tropes to do to me if I go and answer yes?
I am beginning to fear that you are too ignorant to recognize whatever stupid disasters you are blundering into, that I am not being told about. You heard the report of the Whisperwood incident and didn't recognize Keltham's hand, or his purpose, or his person. You haven't figured out that it was Sevar and not Pineda who slew Janagor and claimed Wancho for hell.
Well, that answers that at least. It hasn't been lost on the Most High that Abigail's been put to unusual to her travail this last month, not free to pursue her usual plans and plots and whims, forced instead to wait on a child growing in her belly and Keltham's possible destruction of Cheliax, while Carissa Seaver's doings and Aspexia's own paltry plottings are kept from her. Aspexia is, for a fact, starting to worry that the Queen may be going mad of it, being permitted little or no important action. As the Grand High Priestess of Asmodeus, it falls to her to deliver solace in such situations. Is this truly all it takes to drive you unstable? Aspexia says acerbically, letting some of her real contempt creep into her voice. 1 month, living as a literal queen in fine palace, only you have to contend with a few unfamiliar uncertainties and aren't allowed to meddle as you feel like it.
Don't fucking patronize me, Aspexia. I'm not a child in need of some motherly cruelty. The aspect of this situation that is giving me difficulty isn't the lack of action. It's trying to play the game against fucking Keltham, who I suspect of falling barely short of a dark tapestry horror himself in terms of his effects on others' sanity. Sevar's doings at least make sense. This report of Keltham, is it a record of a true event that reached us accidentally, or sped along only by tropes? Is it a report that Keltham permitted and intended to reach us? I can't analyze the plot just by comprehending its obvious effect if I believed it, because Keltham hails from a world of overintelligent madlings where my imagination of that intended effect would just be the first layer of his own intended plot. Calculate the consequences of that? He expects me to do that too, and I can't guess how many layers deep he'll think I'll go. He's from a world that plunges their children into false realities to toughen them. There must be some law to govern it. But Seaver is lost. Asmodia is lost. Avaricia and Meritzel and Shalira are not trope-touched and haven't the skill. Talandria has twisted herself into a knot that's fucking useless for any plots more diabolical than diamond chemistry. Gorthaclek won't give me any useful answers unless I ask exactly the right question. And you are fucking useless, because for all your vaunted dealings with divinities, you seem to have no concept of what it means to fight someone, fight something that...
If you wish to support this AI reading and others like it, please visit patreon.com/AskWhoCastsAI. Any help is appreciated. And thank you to executive producer John Doe 7776059.